and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. From its beginning, CMC has welcomed everyone. I might also add that CMC has never shied from presenting multiple sides of issues that we face together as a community. I'm Tony Bell, President and CEO of Phoenix Consulting Co., a leadership, learning, and development firm that cultivates emerging and rising leaders. And thank you to today's forum sponsor, Hannah News Service, and thank you to today's forum partners, WBNS 10 TV and the League of Women Voters, Metropolitan Columbus. We would also like to thank the Columbus Dispatch for its support. Today's live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Thank you all for supporting today's forum. Ohio House Bill 616, in its short title, states, regards promotion, teaching divisive, inherently racist concepts, and in its long title states, to amend Section 3313.21, 3314.03, and 3326.11, and to enact Section 3313.6029 of the Ohio Revised Code regarding promotion and teaching of divisive or inherently racist concepts in public schools. If enacted, House Bill 616 would mandate controversial changes to portions of Ohio Revised Code that set standards for public schools. The bill is similar to Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which banned instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation in grades K through 3. Ohio's version of the bill would make discussions of sexual orientation or gender identity illegal in the state's K through 3 public classrooms and would also restrict discussions of race. Note that the CMC invited the two sponsors of House Bill 616, State Representative Gene Schmidt of House District 63 near Cincinnati and Mike Loychik of House District 63 in Northeast Ohio near Youngstown, to participate in today's panel and receive no response. But please welcome today's speaker, Maria Bruno, the Public Policy Director with Equality Ohio. She said she started out life as a natural negotiator because of her two brothers. Scott DiMauro, the President of the Ohio Education Association, who has a really big job to do. Bruce Hooley of the Bruce Hooley Show. He said he didn't really have an intro, so I thought he deserved one. My friend Densil Delahue Porteous, the Executive Director for Stonewall Columbus, Troy McIntosh, Executive Director for the Ohio Christian Network and the Center for Christian Virtue, and our host, Anna Staver, State House reporter for the Columbus Dispatch, USA Today, Gannett, Ohio Bureau. You can learn more about today's speakers. Please learn more about them. I did, not only in your forum brochure, but also on LinkedIn. And if you Google them, you'll be impressed by what you see. Anna, we look forward to today's conversation. Welcome.
That was it. No, thanks. Is it okay if I stick this right here? Okay. Don't want it to fall. There, just a little bit taller. So hi, I'm Anna, and before we get started, I want to say thank you to the Columbus Metropolitan Club for putting together this panel discussion on House Bill 616. Since its introduction in April, the legislation has stirred up controversy, and I know a lot of people, including the people up here on this panel, have strong feelings. And with that in mind, I'm going to direct my questions to individual panelists first, and then I will give everyone else about 45 seconds to comment, react, or respond. And yeah, I'll be keeping time. So when my phone beeps, I'll ask that we move on to the next question, and if you ignore me, I will be forced to bust out my mom voice. And since I have two little girls under the age of 8, I get a lot of practice. All right, let's get started. So House Bill 616 has been described as two bills in one. And one part that restricts, quote, how certain divisive concepts are taught, and a second section that prohibits, quote, any curriculum or instructional materials on sexual orientation or gender identity for children. So I want to start with the latter part first, and my first question is for Troy. So, and it's got a little bit of a setup, so please bear with me. So I'm hoping you can define what sexual orientation and gender identity mean in the context of this bill, because I will freely admit to being a little confused myself. So here's what kind of trips me up. So my daughters, they're 7 and 5 for context. They both are in a huge Disney princess phase, and many of those movies sort of feature romantic relationships. My assumption was that would mean those movies deal with sexual orientation because the characters fall in love, kiss, get married. Is that correct, or am I not understanding how this word is being used in the bill?
Yeah, I mean, that is a question that I would say I would defer to the sponsors of the bill on. I don't necessarily attempt to speak for Representative Schmidt or Lojcik on that. But I think common sense tells us, I think we can all come to some agreement on what those words mean. And that would be that the state ought not to be engaged in the process of providing instruction on or suggesting to children, particularly those in K through 8, children 8 and under, issues regarded to their sexual identity. Do they identify as boy or girl? Are they created and made as a boy or girl? What do they exist? So the intent, I believe, from at least from my perspective, would be to say that the government, by taking on many of the things that we're seeing in classrooms today, where children as young as kindergarten, even as young as preschool, are being suggested that there are multiple genders, 3, 4, however many someone might suggest, and that is diametrically opposed to what at least a large percentage, if not a majority, I don't have polling numbers on this, but certainly a large percentage of families would hold to a very different position. And so what I would relate it to would be in the same way that the state takes a neutral view on religious matters. All right, the state does not take a position in their education on whether the resurrection is a historical fact. They're neutral on that. That doesn't mean that Christian 6-year-old students, because the state is silent on that issue, it can't learn that the resurrection is in fact a fact from their parents. That is something the state has said we're leaving to mom and dad. I would suggest that this falls into that kind of category, that this is an issue that the state doesn't have a substantial interest in and ought to remain neutral on. If mom and dad want to teach the resurrection at home, they're free to. If they want to choose to teach multiple genders or gender identity at home, they're free to, and the state ought not to impinge on that. But what we're saying is when the state takes that upon themselves to do either one of those two things, it's too much power in the hands of the state. And that imbalance of power away from parents toward the state is what the crux of this issue is. And so what this bill and others like it, and I wouldn't quibble on the details of the bill, but I would say what this is representative of is an attempt to take back some of that balance of power back toward the parents.
Thanks. Would anyone like to respond or comment or react? Maria? Okay, I'm going to give you 45 seconds here.
So I kind of find both of the argument that this is about staying neutral and about parents' rights pretty interesting, because I think as far as we can tell, this is very much taking a political position by banning the general conversation topics that might disagree with folks' personal views. And we don't always like what our teachers, say every time in the classroom. I don't anticipate that you as parents have always appreciated everything that comes out of your teachers' mouths, but the point is that this is very much government overreach. It's attempting to police what teachers say within their classrooms, and it polices that using very vague terminology that could be weaponized however they see fit.
Oh, right on time. Perfect. Does anyone else want to add anything? Okay, Bruce?
Yeah, so Ms. Bruno's comment is indicative of the way you're being programmed on this issue. She mentioned the word conversations. The bill specifically says curriculum and instruction materials. It makes no ban at all on conversations. But this is indicative of the alarmist rhetoric that you've been hearing about House Bill 616, that they'll be marginalized, they'll be driven into the closet, they won't be able to talk about their relationships at home. This is just simply not true. And I can give you ample examples of that, which certainly would not fall within my time constraints now. But I would just tell you that anything that people tell you about what teachers can discuss with students and a student asks a question is not covered in the bill and is not part of the bill.
Well, actually, I have a question for you on that later, so hold that thought. But Scott?
Well, I think the way the language of the bill is written, it is very deliberately vague, and there will be all kinds of opportunities to have this kind of debate. Unfortunately, I think this is a litigator's dream come true, because you can expect that there are going to be all kinds of lawsuits over interpreting what actually constitutes curriculum versus a conversation that comes up in the course of a lesson. But what is unmistakable about this legislation is that it is intended to instill fear. And by instilling fear in educators and instilling fear in students, we're closing down important conversations that need to happen in our schools.
And Densil, it looks like you wanted to add something as well.
Densil Porteous, he, they pronouns. So, I think it's interesting because if I recall my days in academia where I served as an instructor and worked with teachers, we often would have to do weekly curricula that suggested what we'd be teaching our students. And if I go way, way back to middle school and elementary school and thinking about how those curricula were developed, we would use language that purported male or female, gender diversity or gender sort of spectrum. We would divide students in the classroom into male and female groups. We would allow students to only travel to restrooms in male and female pairs. So I think we understand that the definition of curriculum and instruction can be loosely defined as a course plan or a lesson plan from a teacher or instructor. And so you will see that notions of gender will creep into those spaces each and every day as they're teaching. So for me, it seems a little bit disingenuous when we think about language and how we use it in this particular moment.
Okay, so my next question is for Maria. Opponents of this bill and a similar one in Florida have nicknamed the legislation Don't Say Gay, even though the words gay, lesbian, transgender don't appear in the legal language. So I wanted to ask you if you could explain how the bill's got this nickname and why you think it is or isn't appropriate.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the reason that we call it Don't Say Gay, Don't Mention Race is because that will be the impact of this bill. There will be teachers that don't get close to the line because they're not sure where the line is because, as we've mentioned, the language is very vague and could be weaponized. We're already seeing it be weaponized. We've seen plays get canceled because a character is alluded to being gay. We've seen teachers get reprimanded for asking someone's pronouns. This is already happening. And the language within this bill, it says materials on, so I do take issue with the interpretation of what that means. That really is anything that is in the classroom. On sexual orientation or gender identity. Neither of those terms are defined. And I can't imagine they're talking about Cinderella and the Disney princesses, right? We know what they mean, even if they don't say the word gay. I have a sneaking suspicion if there was a conversation about being heterosexual, that would not classify under some folks' interpretation of that language. But straight is a sexual orientation. Man and women are genders. The language in this bill does not specify.
Would anyone like to respond or react? Bruce?
Yeah, I think there's a very simple reason why it's labeled the Don't Say Gay bill is because that inspires outrage among everyone. It would inspire outrage on my end. There's no reason why you should preclude language. I'm about a free exchange of ideas. And it's very interesting to me that Ms. Bruno's organization, Mr. Porteous' organization, asks us to be respectful of their pronouns. If I were to refer to Leah Thomas, the swimmer from Penn, who is a biological male, transgender woman, if I were to refer to Leah Thomas as he, I would be hateful. If I were to refer to Leah Thomas as Will Thomas, I would be dead-naming him. But the courtesy of calling people by what they ask to be called, what they feel inside, is required of us, but we are told time after time after time in Anna's publication and in others that opponents call it the Don't Say Gay bill. So it's okay for us to call it the Don't Say Gay bill because opponents call it the Don't Say Gay bill. I would be very upset if anyone called Mr. Porteous by a name that opponents often call people who are members of Stonewall Union. I would be very upset if someone referred to people by a name that is not the name they choose because they would be dead naming them. But that courtesy is not given to those of us who are advocates of House Bill 616. Headlines repeatedly in the dispatch say, don't say gay, don't say gay, don't say gay, because it's meant to inspire your outrage. It's intentional on the part of all the agencies that use that labeling.
Anyone else? Okay, so Bruce, this is actually the question that you referenced earlier. So one of the debates in Florida that we've been hearing about is the difference between conversation and instruction. And so the Florida bill's sponsor, his name is Joe Harding, and he said having a conversation about gay parents wouldn't qualify as instruction, and the same would be true for an essay or a family tree that hangs on the classroom wall. And I wanted to see if that's your interpretation of 616, that these kinds of conversations would be allowed to continue.
Yeah, it's absolutely. In reading the bill is very clear that it's instruction materials, books, things, worksheets, things like that. And it goes back to what Troy said earlier about we just don't want the state taking a position of advocating for one thing versus another. So it is not in the bill that you can't answer a question. I know in one of the, let's see, I counted them up the other day. Since the introduction of House Bill 616 on April the 5th, the Columbus Dispatch has written at least 9, I have copies of them with me, 9 news stories, all critical of House Bill 616. They have also written 9 editorials. They have enlisted everyone on their staff who writes an opinion piece. They enlisted the head of the American Federation of Teachers to write an opinion piece. They even went to Dayton, Ohio, and located a transgender hairstylist to write a piece in opposition to House Bill 616. But curiously, the Dispatch has not been able to find in all of Central Ohio one advocate for House Bill 616 to write a piece extolling the need for House Bill 616. So I don't know about you guys, but when I'm only given one side of the story, I get suspicious. I wonder, when people lie to me, why are they lying to me? And a lot of times people think, well, they're lying to you to inspire fear, which is what Mr. DiMauro said, or they're lying to scare you. But basically the reason why people lie to you is always the same reason. No one lies to you if they have truth on their side, because you would always rather win an argument with truth than with lies. But if you don't have truth on your side, if the bill says instruction materials, curriculum, clearly stated, and you like to fundraise off the alarmist rhetoric that all these organizations are spewing about House Bill 616, well, then it's not really a lawyer's dream, it's a fundraising dream for all the agendas that are represented here, except for from Troy and myself.
Just real quick clarification. So I'm the legislative reporter who covers this, but I am technically not a Dispatch employee. I am a USA Today Gannett, Ohio employee, which means I write for our 21 papers. But I've only written 2 articles on this, and Aaron Baer, who is works with Troy, has been featured in both. But
Has he written his own standalone editorial like?
I have no control over the editorial board of the Dispatch.
Do you dispute my statement that there have been 9 editorials written in opposition to House Bill 616 in the Dispatch, but no advocate for House Bill 616 has been given the space either on your website or in your newspaper to write a standalone piece advocating for House Bill 616?
Again, I don't work for the Dispatch, but I do not know what their editorial page editor, Amelia Robinson, has been offered. I don't know if she's reached out to the bill sponsors. I do know they won't talk to any reporter about it. I don't know if they would write an editorial piece. I don't know if they've reached out to Aaron or Troy. I can't say who's been offered and who's declined.
Does it seem to you odd, as a graduate or a professional in journalism, that every single story that's published in the Columbus Dispatch would take one position on the issue rather than present a countervailing view?
It may just be because nobody has offered to write it, but we need to move on. Maria, did you want to have a response?
Yeah, I would say an alternative interpretation of people not writing these op-eds is that this is an extreme minority position, and most people understand why this bill is bad. As far as facts versus fiction, another fact about this bill is within the language of this bill, it bans offering teachers and employee diversity, equity, and inclusion training. That goes so far past materials towards kids about LGBTQ issues. This is about not even offering training that would allow people to create inclusive environments.
One of the things that I would point out in this whole exchange about the debate, the day that the bill was introduced, neither of the co-sponsors was willing to answer reporters' questions. And in fact, one of the co-sponsors, I think famously, was seen running away from a reporter. And the reality is that this bill is copy and pasted from a national conservative network that is using this not to address education needs of students in the state of Ohio, but instead to score political points in an election season by tapping into people's fears and insecurities. I think that if anyone should be outraged about the lack of engagement and facts and really addressing what our students need, it should be those people who are understandably opposed to this bill and the impact that this bill is going to have on our state.
Densil? Oh, Troy. Okay, we'll go to Troy, then Densil.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just respond to the statement that this is an extreme minority position. I think that is almost patently false in that we saw this issue turn a gubernatorial election in Virginia just within the last year. This is an issue that a significant number of parents care about. And this is the crux of the issue. We can talk about all these issues on the periphery. The crux of the issue is, should the state have the authority to compel education to a student? In Ohio, we have compulsory education. The state compels the education of students, and to control the content of that instruction in a way that violates the deeply held beliefs of a significant, if not a majority number of parents. That's the crux of the issue. And this bill is saying, in the same way that we cannot teach the resurrection, we cannot teach about pilgrimages to a Hajj, at least as fact, as a responsibility, we should not be teaching existential issues like this to children who are clearly not developmentally ready for it. There is no way. If you look at the gender unicorn that is widely given to teachers to teach on this issue, it's asking questions that a 6-year-old can't possibly comprehend.
The argument seems really interesting on all points, because I wonder how many people are actually educators, teachers creating this content, and if they, can speak to the sort of slippery slope that happens when you're teaching young kids. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and no matter how much I try not to talk about gender and identity, because I know that she's figuring it out, and she tells me she's a she, but I don't know where she got that from because it wasn't from me, Like in our home, we respect people as individuals, as entities, who they are, and they discover those things on their own. And from all of the experiences that she's had in her preschool classroom, she comes home and tells me that she's a girl. I don't know who's telling her that, and I'm sure that the teachers in some way, shape, or form are finding it pretty complicated to navigate that system of conversation with these young people who contextually don't have the mental capacity to understand what gender is, but somehow they do. So the space I always turn to is, what are our teachers struggling with? We are a bunch of pontificants sitting on a stage talking about this, and the closest person to an academic on the stage right now is me, because I've taught and I've had that experience. So I mean, in terms of the 5-year-old space. Sorry, in terms of that adolescent space.
Actually, that leads in perfectly to my next question for Scott, since he is a high school history teacher. So I wanted to ask you about the penalties in this bill. So parents would be allowed to file complaints, and punishments could go all the way up to the loss of a teaching license. I wanted to get your reaction to this process and maybe what you've heard from other educators at your school.
So yes, I am a high school social studies teacher. I've been in education for 30 years. I went into education and I specifically chose social studies because I believe it's very important to give students the critical thinking, problem-solving, decision-making skills that they need in order to be good citizens in our democracy. And that means being exposed to multiple perspectives on a variety of issues, and also making sure that we're giving students a complete and truthful, honest education. So when we see this, and remember, House Bill 616 is the latest version of a series of bills that have been introduced. House Bill 327 has also received a lot of attention, and there have been different penalties included in these bills. Again, it goes back to this idea: I don't want to do something that will be construed by someone as violating the law, offending someone. This is kind of taking us to cancel culture in a whole different way, on a whole new level. Offending someone where I'm going to have to go before the State Board of Education and the Ohio Department of Education to defend my license. Various versions of this bill would also financially penalize school districts. All of this is a distraction. This is all taking attention away from what educators really want to be talking about, which is how do we ensure that we have the resources necessary to give every single one of our students, regardless of their race, regardless of their income level, regardless of their gender, regardless of who they are, where they come from, the opportunity to succeed. Now, I know that employers today, and this is one of the interesting questions about this bill, is like, where's the business community? I don't think there's a lot of enthusiasm here, a lot of thought that this is going to be drawing people to the state of Ohio, because employers want people who are going to be good communicators, who are going to be critical thinkers, who are going to be empathetic to their peers, and legislation like this just really works counter to that.
Does anyone want to add anything? Or, okay, Bruce, go ahead.
So first of all, I want to say I agree with Scott totally, that I think it is reprehensible that Representatives Loychek and Schmidt have not taken a frontline position to speak about a bill that they sponsored. I think they should absolutely, positively do that. And if you don't have the will to do that, you shouldn't sponsor the bill. Secondly, I take issue with his point that in his position, teachers around the state of Ohio, some of whom are Christian teachers, some of whom oppose teaching kids young as kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, which are the only kids addressed in terms of keeping them from being taught these materials in curriculum. Teachers are made to sit in developmental seminars all the time. Hilliard Davidson teachers sat in a developmental seminar recently where a representative named Amanda from Kaleidoscope Youth Center was explaining gender and the differences in the genders, and boys may identify as girls, girls may identify as boys. And her exact quote was, "I know you as adults may not understand this, but believe me, 12-year-olds understand it perfectly." Well, trust me, as a parent of a 12-year-old, I thought I'd check, and I asked her if that was true, and she said, "Dad, trust me, we don't understand anything about this. In particular, boys don't understand anything about it." So they're not given the choice to sit out these developmental seminars. And we are in the midst of Gay Pride Month, and a lot of you are business people. I'm just curious, you don't have to raise your hands, but I'm curious how many of you feel under pressure at your work to include a rainbow emblem or your pronouns on your emails, and if you were given the choice not to do that, you would choose not to do that.
Okay, Maria, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, I wanted to respond to the allegations made against Kaleidoscope Youth Center because that also came up in sponsor testimony yesterday. So let's talk about what Kaleidoscope Youth Center is. It's a drop-in center for homeless youth, for LGBTQ youth who are struggling with their mental health or who just need community. They go through and they provide more contextual trainings to adults who are looking to better understand this set of issues. This is not, again, this is not even the first time that this specific conversation has been referenced. We want to talk about raising money off of villainizing other people. How about taking someone who works at a drop-in center, plucking out one sentence, and then running it around the whole nation, hoping that it catches fire?
Well, I had 45 seconds. I could give you a whole bunch more comments from that, but do you dispute that I repeated her comments to you accurately?
I don't know, I wasn't there.
I can play the tape for you if you'd like to hear it.
Okay, so now I'd like to pivot towards the divisive concept aspect of House Bill 616. I want to make sure we get to that, and I want to start with Densil. So this question is for you. Going to turn the page here. So the bill lists a few specific topics as divisive or what they call inherently racist. And these are critical race theory, intersectional theory, the 1619 Project. But it also has broader prohibitions on things like diversity, equity, and inclusion learning outcomes. And I wanted to ask you, what place, if any, do you see these different specifics like 1619 or broader DEI training having in K through 12 education? Oh, it was for Densil, I'm sorry.
No. I was processing the question.
Oh, sorry. No, Maria was looking at me like, is that my question?
No, I heard it. It's interesting because I can remember being in high school and learning the limits of my language or the limits of my world. And I think when I contextually think about K through 12 education and what's being limited here, I think it's the limits of my child's world. If they are not taught, hopefully in a place that's safe and supportive of identity and instruction, the distinctions between racism, white supremacy, and sort of cultural identity, then they will never be able to formally sort of understand who they are as they're developing. I think instruction in the classroom, in particular in these topics, and I think some of these things are more slighted towards the higher end of the academic spectrum as the way it relates to in the bill. We've heard here that maybe people who are in the teenage years may not have the mental capacity to understand some of these concepts, but I think we know the discussion should be happening in a safe space, which I thought schools were to be safe spaces for education and learning. And I think if we're not nurturing that in some way, shape, or form, then we're doing ourselves a disservice of developing contributing citizens. I think ultimately we need to be able to create the space that encourages appropriate dialogue about these topics, so that our young people feel safe having these conversations once they step out into the real world. Because I know right now, I don't think a lot of them probably do feel safe having these conversations outside of, most spaces.
Troy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Denzel. I appreciate that sentiment. What I would want to point out, though, is I want to make sure we don't avoid a straw man fallacy here, and that there's nothing in the bill that prevents dialogue on racism. There's nothing in the bill that prevents dialogue on the history of abuse toward Black Americans. That is real. Nobody here would ever consider denying that. What? Some people will. Well, okay, so nobody's sitting here. I think the issue comes down to what perspective are you using when you look at those abuses, right? There are multiple perspectives to look at them. The critical race theory perspective is avowedly a Marxist perspective. They're very clear about that. The proponents of CRT have repeated that over and over again. Derek Brown from Harvard University is one of the leading proponents of CRT. He's an avowed Marxist. The issue there is not that everything that somebody who advocates CRT is saying is wrong. That's not the case. The issue is, what is the fundamental organizing principle that they're viewing this issue through? The issue that they view it through is one of irreparable oppression between one group and another. And I think the state has a legitimate interest in saying that is not what the state is going to advocate. Again, that is not a limitation on the issue of diversity or racial abuse or even structural racism, right? It's the issue of saying that's not going to be the fundamentally organizing principle that we present in our schools.
I just find it,
Okay.
as an educator, and listening to conversations about, we believe collectively that freedom is very important, free exchange of ideas, learning multiple perspectives. But proponents of legislation like this want to single out certain perspectives that they find disagreeable and censor those. For all the talk about standing up for freedom, this is an ultimate act of state control and seizing power away from local communities and the level where these important decisions are being made. And again, you want to talk about a straw man. Let's talk about the straw man of CRT. Most people, as an educator, I'd never even heard of it. Somebody who spent 30 years in a social studies classroom until about a year and a half ago, it became a trending topic on Fox News, and then everybody else was suddenly talking about it. So the reality is, and again, look at the language of the bill when it says you can't talk about, or you can't, I forget exactly how it's stated, but prohibiting diversity, equity, inclusion training and curriculum related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. How sweeping a prohibition like that is, and all the implications that that's going to have. As a teacher, I want my students to learn from their mistakes so that they can grow as individuals. As a history teacher, I want my students together to learn about the history of our nations and learn from the mistakes so we can be better as a country too.
Real quick before we go to Troy, I just wanted to, I have the bill here just in case we had a question about what it said. So it does say that you cannot offer training or professional development to employees that promote or endorse divisive or inherently racist concepts, and you cannot teach, use, or provide for use by any student any curriculum, instructional material, or assignment designed to promote or endorse these concepts. So just so we're all on the same page, I brought it just in case we needed a quick check. And so Troy, then Maria.
Sure. Yeah, in response to Scott, I think I would also agree that there is real value in the free exchange of ideas, no doubt. And yet, the state still limits that free exchange of ideas in any number of areas. Again, I've already mentioned one. There's no free exchange of ideas on religious issues in a school. There's no free exchange. We don't bring in advocates from the Flat Earth Society, except in some odd, unusual class that might be looking at like political extremism or scientific, extremism. That's not part of what schools do. The school limits what they do based on certain principles. And this is one that I think the state has a legitimate interest in saying, this is not a perspective that we're going to bring out and advocate within schools. Again, free exchange of ideas is great, but there are always limits to that.
Okay, Maria?
So you mentioned, I appreciate you reading the actual statutory language, and I think I will add to that. I have another, it says inherently racist concepts. The list of the things that they count as inherently racist concepts are as follows: critical race theory, intersectional theory, 1619 Project, diversity, equity, and inclusion learning outcomes, inherited racial guilt, and any other concept the State Board of Education defines as divisive or inherently racist. This literally gives our very politicized Board of Education a carte blanche to ban whatever they feel like.
Okay, so we have time for one more question before we go to all of your questions. So I just want to ask all of you a question that I like to ask at the end of my interviews, which is, what is one thing that you wish the opposition understood about you or your position? And it's a quick question for each of you. So we'll start with Maria, and we'll just go straight down the line. Not to put you on the spot.
That's okay. I think that I would appreciate if they understood that my top priority is the mental health and safety of youth in this state. And I don't think this bill is anywhere near going that direction, but I think they constantly are putting words in our mouth about our intentions, and truly the only intention is that youth stay healthy and happy and alive.
I would hope that proponents of this legislation would understand the impact that it has on educators who are already feeling incredibly burnt out right now. Educators have been on the front line of the pandemic. They've been on the front line of dealing with all kinds of resource inequities across the state. There's talk now about, with the recent shootings, how we're on the front line of, safety. But these kinds of curriculum attacks are contributing to a culture which is driving people away from being educators. We need more people coming into the profession, not going the other way.
Before we get to Bruce, I realized I messed up. I forgot to tell you guys that if you want to ask a question and you are here in this room, you need to go line up behind Doug, he's standing right over there with the microphone, and please make your questions brief and to the point. Doug will try to help you move it along. I might try to help, but if you want to ask a question, just go line up right over there by the microphone. So I'm sorry, Bruce, go right ahead.
What I would hope the other side would understand is that parents want to protect their children and they want the right to raise their children the way they want, and there are some concepts that are appropriate for home and there are some that are appropriate for school. I read recently in the Dispatch that the number of children third grade level who do not attain state reading levels is 39%. 39%. Mr. DiMauro asked for more resources. I would ask what they're doing with the resources they have. So I think there are things in grades K, 1, 2, and 3 that are more important than talking about sex and gender ideology when 39% of the kids can't read at state level. And I think we were all emotionally torn a week ago today when we looked into a collage of pictures of those little children in Uvalde who died in the shooting. We have to protect the innocence of our kids. And I heard so often in the aftermath of that, this didn't happen when I was a kid. Well, this is a very different America than when we were kids. And kids are, because of these and other things, fed lots of concepts they're not capable of understanding. We've had a lot read from this bill today. One of the standards in this bill that is often mentioned is age appropriateness. And age appropriateness does not or should not allow for sex and gender ideology and the fact that America was founded to be a racist country to be taught to kids who are K, 1, 2, and 3rd grade.
I think mine is pretty simple. I want to make sure that people find their happiness. And happiness for many of us resides in our identity and how we develop. And I think that if we aren't creating spaces where we as adults remember what it was like to be young people and how challenging it might have been to understand and discover who we were, then we need to do the work to make sure that our young people are growing up and finding spaces where they can develop and understand who they are and be fully happy people. So, for me, it is pretty basic. The work that I do and the reason why I sit in these places and spaces is to ensure that people are working towards their personal happiness.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I would give a very similar response for what my new friend Densil just said and Maria said. I spent the last 27 years in schools trying to do the very things that they just stated they want to accomplish in the lives of kids. That is what I would do. What happens, though, is Densil and I, although I'm sure we agree on many things, if he's a Browns fan, we may agree on one more thing. Okay, I'm sure we agree on many things, but we have fundamentally different worldviews that lead us to interpret things in different ways, right? And so how he views giving kids space to be happy is naturally flowing from a worldview that he holds that's different than my worldview, so I would approach that concept differently. And in a lot of ways, they're irreconcilable. This is the problem we have in today's society. How do you live in a pluralistic, multicultural society when you have things that want to force them into one method? That's why, I'll give a little a plug here, House Bill 290 attempts to approach this, the backpack bill, by giving parents the ability to say, this is the kind of education I want my student to have. And they should have the ability to take the state's funding with them to that particular kind. If a parent elects to have a school that teaches gender identity to K through third graders, then they ought to be able to have that authority and they ought to be able to go to that school. If a parent has a fundamentally different worldview and an idea of what they want their kid to be, then if the state's going to compel that child to go to school, they ought to have the ability to take the money the state provides and select the kind of education they want for their kid.
Well, thank you all so much for your thoughts. And now we are going to turn to audience questions. It's CMC's longstanding tradition to take questions from our audience, and Doug Buchanan is going to curate those questions both from the folks in the room and from the folks listening on the live stream. So for our in-house audience, it looks like we're already lined up. So please keep your questions brief. And Doug, what is our first question?
Anna, thank you, and thank you to today's panelists, and thank you all to our audience members for being here today for an important conversation. Suzanne Davis with Questline asks, do you recommend employers who are allies to the LGBTQ+ community and who endorse DE&I send out some kind of message about HB616 to staff? What content for such a message would you recommend?
Well, it sounds like that question is probably for either Maria or Densil, so I will let either of you take that.
Okay, I can take first stab here. It's critical that everyone who supports DE&I is speaking up right now. You know, we have talked about the op-eds. That's a great way to voice your opposition, and it's clearly working because it's giving the false impression that people are being silenced when the reality is that people really are not that divided about this issue. Most folks actually appreciate and endorse DE&I training. We encourage businesses who are in support of those to continue to voice their opposition. I also think it's worth noting, you know, this affects employers already. So we are already there in trying to police the minutia of management of employees.
Anyone else? Okay, it looks like we have a question from the audience here.
Hi, my name is Nidhi Satyani. I'm a community member. I have a couple questions for Bruce and Troy. So first, thank you for being here. I understand just from the applause that this may not be the most friendly environment for both of you. So I appreciate you being here. My question for Bruce is, you've talked about how the dispatch has not talked about the need for 616. So I'd like you to tell me why you think we need 616. And my question for Troy is, first, I wanted to point out, there isn't a teacher out there who has dialogue without supporting instructional material. So by saying we can have dialogue, but we can't have the instructional material, actually just creates bad learning. So I'd like to get away from the dialogue versus instructional material piece and talk more about, you said it's important that we are aligned with the values of the majority of our country. So my question for you is, how do we become a more perfect union if we are only advocating for the values of the majority of our country?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if I said that, clearly I misspoke, because that is not a position that I would hold to. What I intend to say is that again, it's getting back to what I defined as the fundamental question here. Does the state have the authority to both compel education and control the content in a way that is diametrically opposed to fundamentally held views of a large percentage of Americans? And I would argue that point is no. The state ought to be taking a neutral position on that, or better yet, as I mentioned, allow them to take their funding to the school of their choice.
You specifically mentioned that we all agree that slavery is something that shouldn't have happened. And had we been having this conversation, 50 years ago, your argument would actually say that the schools can't talk about slavery. And so I feel like your messages are contradicting themselves.
Yeah, again, I would dispute that. I think that's a straw man argument of my position. I taught, again, for 27 years. I was in schools, and I can guarantee you that the school I was in taught about slavery, taught about racial abuse, taught about issues of racism in culture. It was done, again, from a different perspective than what CRT is going to take, someone who has again, a fundamentally different worldview. And so those issues, again, those issues, I'm not saying that they're off limits and that you can't, nobody is suggesting that you can't teach slavery and the horrific abuses that have taken place in our country's history. I just think that's a straw man argument.
So in answer to your question about why do we need House Bill 616, it's interesting to sit in this room with a bunch of clearly successful people, leaders in the business community. And I would just ask you, when were sexual topics and sex education topics broached with you in school? You've obviously had a successful route to the top. Were they broached with you when you were in kindergarten, first grade, second grade? Or were they broached with you in sixth grade or ninth grade? What's the hurry? What's the need to talk to kids about this? It's also interesting that I was on Nationwide Children's Hospital's website, their On Our Sleeves campaign. I'd invite you all to pull out your phones at some point and Google Nina West, On Our Sleeves, Nationwide Children's Hospital. Nationwide Children's Hospital, which cares for children and is one of the great assets in our community, has a mental health ambassador who is a man who dresses as a woman. And when you find Nina West's webpage, Nina West's biography will say that the most important thing is for Nina West to be kind to me. The most important person is me. Now I ask you, as parents, do you cultivate an attitude of selfishness and a child is the most important person in your family? Or do you think we'll have a better culture if we cultivate an attitude of sacrifice and compromise? That's why I think we need House Bill 616, because it is not age appropriate at K, 1, 2, and 3 for these topics to be broached with children.
But you just said we don't have those topics that are taught, that we taught them in 8th grade, so how do you?
Yep. Let's go to the next audience question. Thank you. Benedetta Corey asks, do we know if either part of this bill is planned to be expanded to higher education, public higher education?
Actually, I will pivot the question to him just because we have worked on the other bills that include higher education. So yes, there is one, but I will let Scott give you the answer.
Yeah, House Bill 327 also addresses higher education. And that, again, when you talk about an assault on academic freedom, that's been a real concern there. I think I do want to just briefly talk about this issue of age-appropriate standards. One of the problems of this legislation is that it paints with such a broad brush. We have state learning standards. We have local board-adopted curriculum in every district in the state. Our teachers who work in our public schools across Ohio just want the freedom to do the job that they were trained to do and to do the job that they were hired to do, and that is to teach those standards and teach that curriculum. And if there are issues in the standards or curriculum that should be changed, we have a public process for addressing that. But I'm not hearing specific standards that are being addressed or specific curriculum that people are suggesting that be changed. But we're going to welcome that conversation. We want educators at the table. I will point out, Ohio is the only state in the nation that does not have comprehensive health education standards. So just how about we start there? And let's talk about adopting some comprehensive health education standards.
How about we start with getting 39% of the kids in 3rd grade to be able to read at a 3rd grade level?
So actually, it's 5 to 6% that get retained. I wrote the article on that. The 39% was the Columbus City Schools.
Yeah, you wrote 5 to 6% retain, and there's an argument about whether it's appropriate or not to advance kids even though they can't read at the 3rd grade reading level.
Yeah. Okay, before we get into it, there looks like a very lovely lady in a blue blazer who would like to ask a question.
My name is Burl Brown Pickle Antonio, and I have the honor of serving as board president on the Gahanna Jefferson School Board. I was able to watch sponsor testimony yesterday and heard repeated today that the purpose of this bill is to give parents parental control. My question is related actually to what Scott was just talking about. In the state of Ohio, the way that curriculum is set is that locally elected boards of education set that curriculum within the standards that are set by the Ohio Department of Education. And my question is, how does this legislation respect the parental control that is exercised by the voters who elect their boards of education members every 2 years? And additionally, how does this legislation fit with our Ohio ideals of local control?
Troy, would you want to take that? Not to put you on the spot.
Sure. Obviously, I'm a supporter of local control and local control over schools in particular. At the same time, we are buried with other issues that the state says this is important enough that we are going to put even restrictions on what local school bodies are capable of doing. There are any number. The Ohio operating standards are nothing but regulations that local school boards have to abide within. And so I would say you can still support the idea of local control, but do that within limits. In a democracy, there are always limits on the exercise of any type of authority. And I think this is as legitimate as many of the others that we have.
Should usurp the parents who voted to elect those boards of education to set the curriculum within
that argument really doesn't
standards?
work because those parents also elected the state representatives and senators who passed the limit that you're referring to.
Okay, well, it looks like we might have one last question from online, and Doug is going to read it.
Thank you. Actually, Anna, we are out of time, and I'm sorry that we did not get to other questions, including questions from multiple perspectives. So thank you very much to everyone who got up to ask a question, and I'm sorry that we are just running out of time today. But thank you, Anna, and thank you to our panelists.
Okay.
Well, we wish we had more time, and so thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you to Anna, our panelists, all of our guests and members, and those of you watching via live stream. I hope you found today's forum informative. I learned or was reminded to read the bill and read the legislation for yourself. And I also learned and was reminded that a complete and honest and truthful education, irrespective of race, religion, economic status, identity, anything else, is going to take all of us working together. So please make plans to join us at next Wednesday's forum for a Central Ohio Hospital CEO Roundtable featuring the CEOs of all 4 of our hospital systems. Thank you to today's, you sound like pretty darn excited about it, so I hope full house next week. We'll see you next week. Thank you also to today's forum sponsor, the Hannah News Service. Thank you to today's forum partners, WBNS 10 TV, and the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. Thank you as well to the Columbus Dispatch for your support. And thank you to our online and virtual seat patrons and the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And again, special appreciation to today's speakers, Troy McIntosh, Densil Porteous, Scott DiMauro, Bruce Hooley, and Maria Bruno. Thank you all, and of course, thank you to Anna Staver for being our fearless leader here. Thank you for joining us, and we certainly could not do this without each and every one of you. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. You're coming back, right? We'll see you next Wednesday. Go ahead and register if you haven't, and we thank you as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another informative conversation. Thank you.